All right, so I'm just going to get cracking into it. So um, I think this topic about the psychology of eating meat and the psychology of consumption in general is really interesting. And I'm going to talk about a couple of reasons why in this talk. So first of all, producing meat causes both harm to animals and the environment. But most people care about animals and most people care about the environment. But in addition, most people also eat meat. And so in this way, eating meat is paradoxical because people can both be concerned about and like animals and the environment, but also do things that harm both of those things. So I'm going to begin this talk by talking about the psychology behind this, behind eating meat. There is also some other ways that we can think about consumption, and one of the examples, and there are many different examples of consumption, of course, but one of the examples I'm going to talk about is clothing. So similarly, like meat, the production of clothing is also very damaging for the environment, and it also involves lots of exploitation of workers around the world and the global supply chains. So I'm going to talk about that after the psychology of eating meat as well. I'm then finally going to discuss the similar sort of psychological overlap between these two practices and what this might mean for sustainability and environmentalism. Okay, so I'm going to start off like really broad, looking on the global sphere of meat consumption around the world. So what you're looking at here is average meat consumption per capita, so per person by country. And what you can see is that the darker colors, so the countries colored in darker red, they consume the most meat around the world. And then the lighter the red towards the orange and the light yellow, they consume the least amount of meat. So as you can see, there's quite a geographical distribution, quite variability in the amount of meat people eat per country. So if you look over on the left in the Americas, you can see that in the Americas, people eat a lot of meat. And so in the center, on the top, people in Europe, also around Russia and China, and then also down in the south, in Australia and New Zealand, where I'm from, we also eat a lot of meat there. And then meat consumption is generally very low around Asia and Africa and the Middle East. Just to sort of think about the context behind eating meat and how this relates to some other things, I just want you to think for a second, like, if this graph wasn't showing meat consumption, what would this pattern of results show? What could this be a graph of if it wasn't a graph of meat consumption? So you can either just think about that yourself, or if you'd like, you can pop that in the chat box and just say what you think this graph might show. Okay, so Katie straight off the bat has said wealth, got GDP, money, exactly. So that's what I was going for, that generally the countries who are wealthier, the more developed and prosperous a country is, the more meat they consume. And that's of course because in poorer countries, animals are more useful alive than they are dead. What about anything else? Let's see, there's something else that this graph could represent as well, and that's carbon emissions and environmental damages. Sophie's just said as well, yeah. So there's this relationship between how prosperous a country is, how much meat they consume, and how much they degrade the environment, because these things all go together. Okay, so that's meat consumption like on a global sort of level. What about within a country? We can also think about how much meat consumption varies within a population. And so to do that, and I'm going to get Ella to help me out with this, we've got a quiz. I just want to ask you a few questions about what you know about who eats the most meat. And let's just use the example of the UK. So you'll see a quiz popped up there, and there's a few questions that you can ask. And then I'll answer. I've asked the questions, you can answer them, about who you think eats the most meat. So the first question is about, is this poll live? Oh yeah, there we go, people answer. Okay, cool. So the questions are about who eats more meat. Do more men eat more meat, or is it more women? Do we think older generations of people eat more meat, or is it younger? Or is it about the same? Is there any relationship between meat consumption and political orientation? Perhaps why might that be? What about in total, how much of the UK population eats meat? And then finally, I've got a question about your own meat eating and whether or not you're a vegetarian or not, just to sort of gauge what the audience is here. So just take your time. I'm just going to have another wee bit more to go. Ella, do you think that's fine? I'll let you sort of decide when we sort of close that off. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these results. So yeah, most people got this right. So men do typically eat more meat than women. And the second question, more older people tend to eat more meat, and the younger generations tend to be more likely to be vegetarian. Similarly, most people got this right, that people who are more politically conservative tend to eat more meat. And that's for a variety of reasons that we won't really go into in this talk. But less people got that one right. But yeah, there is a conservative sort of relationship between eating meat. And then in terms of what percent of the UK eats meat, okay, good, I've got you on one. So most people have said either 90% or 95%, and only 10% have said 97%, but the research tends to show that it's probably about 97% is the most reliable figure of how many people eat meat. So that's very good. So most people got all those right. And then if we look down at the demographic of people listening today, we have 30% of people eat meat, 40% saying that they do, but they're reducing how much they eat. And then we've got about a quarter vegetarian, and then a sort of similar number vegan. So that's cool. It's quite actually an even sort of spread. Cool. Thanks, Alice. So guess we'll stop sharing those results. Hopefully the poll should have disappeared by the Zoom magic, if I'm correct. Okay. So that was looking at demographics of who was most likely to eat meat. What about what sort of animals do we eat? So the people who eat, what sort of animals do we eat? I think, actually, just before I jump into that, I do want to make a point of saying that even though on average men typically eat more meat than women, and politically conservative people tend to eat more meat, and the older generations as well, still, as that last figure shows, about 97% of people in the UK eat meat. So even though men eat a bit more meat than women, most women eat meat, and most left-wing people eat meat, and most young people eat meat as well. So these are just general trends. Okay, so we're going to turn to what about the animals? What sort of animals do we eat in the UK? So in the order that they appear there, so chicken, pigs, cows, and sheep, that's the amount those are the animals that we eat the most. So we eat the most chicken meat, and then pigs, cows, and sheep. Now, of course, as everyone knows, we only eat a very select few amount of animals, which is quite interesting because there's a huge variety of different animals that we could eat, but we have a lot of cultural norms around what animals are eatable and what animals are not. And we'll get a bit more into that later on. But we could have just a short thought experiment. You don't have to write anything for this, but you might just want to consider why is it that we tend to think that horse meat would be bad? And, there's these sometimes scandals when horse meat ends up being eaten by customers, and that's seen as something, really horrible and distressing and disturbing. But then eating meat from a cow seems like totally normal. So we have these cultural norms around what animals are okay and not okay to eat. There's also some history tied into this, why we eat these sorts of animals as well. And of course, the sort of animals that we eat tend to be animals that can be kept together, and they tend to be quite docile. And we've bred them over thousands of years to be, and we've selected them to be more docile now. So they tend to be fine, kept in cages or pens together, but for the most part, that's not always true, but for the most part. And they also tend to not attack humans who are farming them. So there are these sort of practical reasons why we only eat these sorts of animals as well. Okay, so we know who eats meat. Most people eat meat, and we know we only eat a few sort of animals. What about the environmental consequences of this, which of course is the main theme of this talk? So it's basically every sort of bad thing that you can think about in terms of destroying the environment is associated with eating meat. So eating the farming of meat and the farming of animals, and the producing the land and the clearing of the forest and all that sort of thing associated with farming animals is a massive contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and deforestation. Not just like small forests here and there, but like massive deforestation on a large global scale, including the Amazon. Of course, meat consumption and meat production in the UK doesn't cause deforestation directly, because we've already cleared the forest here over the last hundreds of years. not just because of farming animals, but that was part of it, and to do with other things such as building ships and that sort of thing. But safe to say that we have already cleared the forest here in the UK. There's also things associated with the clearing forests, like species extinction, water use, for the farming, for the crops and the animals. It uses a lot of water. And then also water pollution and the runoff from animals and things like that. Okay, so there's a lot of research showing that animal agriculture is pretty bad for the environment. But how bad is it in comparison to, say, other industries? Because there's, of course, lots of different industries, and I'm only touching on one thing in this talk. I'm just basically touching on the psychology of eating meat and the environmental consequences of that, and then clothing later on. But what about other industries? And a good example might be to look at the transport sector, because it's shown to be a big emitter of, say, carbon dioxide around the world. So we could compare, how does animal agriculture compare to all of the transport in the world? And so the research suggests that on average around the world, the researchers think that the carbon emissions, or the global greenhouse gas emissions, not just carbon, but total greenhouse gas emissions from the transport sector. So that's, all your private cars, as the picture shows, all the trucks, all the transporting of all the goods, and whether that's with trains, with ships, and all the air travel, contributes about 13% of greenhouse gas emissions. We can compare that to approximately 18% of carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions come from the animal agriculture industry. Now, there has been some controversy around this number and around this documentary, which I think is a good documentary, but there's some controversy and some questions around the research that they use. Now, the documentary does use academic research, but some people suggest that perhaps that 18% figure is a bit too high, and it might be something more like around 13%, so perhaps similar to the global transport sector. But even so, even if we take that more conservative estimate, if animal agriculture is just as bad in terms of carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions as the transport sector, it's still something worth looking into. Our diet is still worth looking into. Okay, sorry. Okay, so that's on the global scale. What about in the UK? How do these figures correspond in the UK? So even though on a global scale, animal agriculture is just as bad in terms of carbon emissions for transport, that's not actually the same in the UK. In the UK, transport is actually far more of a emitter of greenhouse gas emissions than agriculture in general. And as you can see here, transport accounts for around 27% of greenhouse gas emissions, and agriculture only 10%. So there is differences within countries and between countries about the emissions per sector, per industry. So it's good to just keep that in mind. In saying that, even though animal agriculture in the UK is not as bad, it's about a third as bad of a carbon emitter and greenhouse gas emitter than transport, there are other reasons why animal agriculture is concerning for the environment. And so two good examples are the land use, the total area of land required to farm animals, and also the water involved in farming animals. And these two things, water and land use, is something I'm going to turn to now and show you an experiment looking at the differences in different diets on these different environmental impacts. Okay, so I'm going to show you a study here, the results of a study that was done in Italy quite recently. And what they did was they looked at 150 Italians, and they separated them by whether or not these people were meat eaters, vegetarians, or vegans. So they had 3 different participant groups, and these people were already meat eaters and vegetarians and vegans. And what they did was they had them to do a diary study. And so they weighed and filled out all their food for 7 days, for a week. And then the researchers calculated the environmental impact of these people's actual diets. So this was the first research of its kind to actually compare people's actual diets, not just what they said that they eat, which I think is really cool. Okay, so what did they find? So what you're looking at here is a graph of the average carbon emissions per day, looking at 3 different diets, as I said before. So you've got on the 3 bars represent the omnivore participants, so that's just people who eat meat, vegetarians, and the vegans. I've colored the vegan bar, the top of the vegan bar green, and the top of the omnivore bar red, just for comparison. And then on the y-axis, the one going up, you've got greenhouse gas emissions equivalent per day. What you can see is that the red bar is higher than the green bar. And so we're seeing that producing this on average, in this Italian study, on average, participants who have a meat diet produce more carbon emissions than the vegetarians or vegans. And so for the omnivores, for the meat eaters, it's about 4,000 grams or 4 kilograms of carbon. And for the vegans, it's almost half that. It's almost around 2,200. So this results show that, yeah, that a meat eating diet is produces more carbon emissions than both the vegetarian and vegan diets. And we see the same pattern again when it comes to the two other ones. But just before we jump on to the next two results, I just want to quickly note, if you look at these bars that I've just put down there, those arrows, what that refers to is the standard deviation. And so what this shows is that even though on average participants in the omnivore condition produce about 4,000 grams of carbon, there's variability within that. So some meat eaters have a higher carbon diet up to around 5,000, and some have a lower carbon diet down to around 3,000. And that 3,000 figure is actually about the height of the highest of the vegan diet. And so what we need to consider as well is that even though on average omnivore or meat eater diets produce more carbon, there are individual differences within that, and there are some vegan diets which are actually worse in terms of carbon emissions than omnivore diets. Okay, see the same pattern of results is the same sort of graph, same three conditions, same participants and everything, but just looking at water use now. The effect is not as pronounced, so meat eaters' diets do consume more water than the vegetarians and vegans, but the effect is not as big as the carbon. We can also then look at the final one, which is land use. And we see again the same effect, the same pattern of results, that the meat eating diet produces, consumes and uses more land than both the vegetarian and the vegan diets. And this happens for both, well, all of the carbon, the water use, and the land use as well. Okay, so we know then that agriculture, and particularly animal agriculture, is pretty bad for the environment. But then why is it? What is some of the psychology behind, like, why do we do this? Even though we know that the stuff is bad, we still do it. And that's something that I find really interesting. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about now. And I'm going to quickly summarize this before going into a little bit more detail. But basically, what you have here in terms of animal agriculture is the perfect storm for apathy. There's a disconnection or a disassociation between the product and the production. And this disconnection or disassociation occurs both in terms of the animals and the harm that animal agriculture causes to animals, but also the environmental consequences of animal agriculture. And so we immediately associate meat with positive things. We associate meat with, having dinner with our family. And when we see meat like this, we think of cooked meat. And we don't associate meat with the consequences of that. And so there are immediate positive consequences to eating meat. And there are very far, very distant, both geographically and psychologically distant consequences for eating meat. And that's why it's so hard to change. And that's why it's quite an interesting behavior, I think. Okay, so there are sort of two main aspects to it, and I sort of alluded to this in the title of my talk, sort of out of sight, out of mind. So the out of sight part of it is it's geographical for a lot of it. So simply living in urban environments now, as you can see in this graph here, this is a graph of population density in the UK, in England here. And what you can see, of course, is that the darker the area, so the darker the red, those are more dense areas. And then going through to like yellow, green, and then blue is the least dense areas. And what you'll notice is, of course, is that this is also could be a map of agriculture, of farming, of where slaughterhouses occur, where factory farms occur, because all of those tend to occur in more rural areas for a variety of reasons, good economic reasons. But also it's convenient because it helps to hide the supply chain of factory farming or animal agriculture in general, both in terms of the harm it does to animals and also in terms of environmental consequences. So, and I sort of summarize that by saying that it's out of sight, that the production or the supply of meat is out of sight. Okay, so the other aspect of this is that eating meat and the consequences are also out of mind. And so we don't tend to not think about these animals because of the geographical reasons, but also we have some sort of biases towards animals as well. And so we actually think less of animals than of animals that we eat compared to animals that we don't eat. So we tend to think that animals that we eat are less intelligent, less worthy of moral concern than other animals. And an interesting question one could ask is, well, perhaps we just tend to eat more dumb animals, right? Like maybe we just choose the less intelligent animals, and maybe it was, done in a sort of reasonable kind of way. And so one thing that psychology can offer is we can do an experiment, test that idea. And so what these researchers did is they gave people a fake animal. They made up an animal called the Bennett's tree kangaroo. And what they said is they described this animal to the participants. And they said that the animal was either eaten, so it was an edible animal, or that people didn't eat it. And in the study, participants attributed less mind and less moral concern. So they thought less of the animal that was eaten than that wasn't eaten, which perhaps suggests that we tend to think less of animals because we eat them. We don't choose animals that are less intelligent or less worthy of moral concern. We sort of do that retrospectively, at least in this case. So another good sort of common example of the psychological distance or disassociation between meat and animals is just in the language that we use. And so we use, language such as we refer to pig's meat as pork and refer to cow's meat as beef as well. And so even in our everyday language, there is this distance between the product, the animal, and the production. So, okay, so we've got this distance. We know that people eat meat, but we tend not to see the farms. We don't see the supply chains. We sort of buy meat in nice, clean packaged bits in the supermarket and that sort of thing. So then we might ask, well, how could we draw that disconnect together? How could we bring the product and production together? And is there any psychological consequences of doing that? So there's been quite a few studies actually, but I'm just going to show you a couple. The first study on the left, we're looking at these pigs. What these researchers did was they had people look at images of a pig that was actually already killed, and it was had been cooked, and it either was the full body of the pig in one condition, or in another condition, so in a separate group of participants, they just saw that pig but without a head. And so people have more empathy and are less likely to say that they would like to eat that animal if the animal has its head, so that if there is reminders of the animal origin of that meat. The next study on the right there showed that people also have more reluctant to eat certain animals. And so what they found is that more cute animals, so baby animals, people are more reluctant to eat those animals than the same species, but of just a few years older. And so they found that people thought that animals, cute animals like this calf here, was less appetizing than an old animal, even though it was the same species. Okay, so those were lab experiments, and they're really useful because they can help us to they're less resource intensive than other more elaborate studies, and so they're very useful. But there's other ways that we can look at this production disconnect. And one of the ways that we've looked at this in Edinburgh was taking people actually to a petting zoo, to a farm, and seeing what psychologically happens about people's attitudes towards animals and attitudes towards meat after interacting with animals. Because if the idea is that there's this production disconnect, well, perhaps if people meet their meat animals, that might change what's happening there. What we did, this is something that I did with Steve Loughlin from the University of Edinburgh, and what we did, is we took students to a small petting zoo called City Farm to play with animals. And we got them to fill out a survey before and after the study to measure any changes in the attitudes towards the animals after interaction. Okay, so what did we find? We found that after interacting with animals, so after drawing that product and production together, people did have improved minds. So they thought animals were more intelligent, more smarter, and more worthy of moral concern. So people, after playing with these animals, relative to how they answered, an hour beforehand, they thought, oh yeah, okay, I see this is like a living animal. This is, I would have more moral concern for this animal. But then you ask those same people in the same survey, would you change eating meat? No. And so in the same survey, in that study, people can change their attitudes towards animals without changing their attitudes towards meat. And so this underscores the meat paradox, underscores this disassociation between product and production, that even after meeting animals and changing attitudes towards animals, it doesn't necessarily change attitudes towards meat. Okay, so in sticking with the theme of this talk, why is it that this happens? Why is it that we have this production disconnect? And why is it such a difficult thing for us to contribute? Why is it that we can contribute to this harm, to environmental harm in terms of animal agriculture? And why are we sort of reluctant? And why is it difficult for us to make that connection? A big part of that problem is because of culture. Eating meat is a massive part of it. And so if you just think about even just the action of eating the meat, eating meat is high in calories. It is, regardless of whether or not you're sort of vegetarian or vegan, like meat is high in calories and it is high in protein. So it is a good food source for a lot of people. And it's very rewarding. A lot of people like meat. It tastes good. And you eat some meat and you have pleasure. It's enjoyable, especially if you do that with nice company. And we don't associate meat with the supply chain. We associate meat with by those things that are immediately reinforcing when we eat meat. The other thing is that because meat eating is such a part of our culture, we grow up, everyone grows up eating, so it's something that almost becomes a habit. And so by the time people get to, in their teens and 20s and they sort of start reflecting on things and the meaning of life and all that sort of good stuff, we already really habitually eat meat. And so a lot of people just tend to not even reflect on it because we do it without sort of thinking sometimes. Now, and to further make this more difficult and more complex, we associate eating meat with a lot of, rituals and prosperity, celebrations, Christmas, whether it's Thanksgiving, the Sunday roast. Meat is really central to our culture. And so we associate meat with these positive aspects of culture. That we associate meat just with the product and the production line or the supply chain. Okay, that's the meat stuff out of the way for the most part. What I want to turn to next is another part is conceptually similar to the psychology of eating meat. And so, it's saying my internet connection is unstable. We'll just give it a second. Okay, so just like eating meat, I'm going to turn to the clothing consumption, and I'm going to show how clothing consumption is also similar in that it's a massive part of our culture, but it also has these massive environmental consequences. Okay, so, clothes are good. Everyone tends to wear clothes. I wear clothes, you wear clothes. I like clothes, I like fabric. Shopping for clothes can be fun. Again, same as the meat, we associate clothing and shopping for clothes with positive experiences like gifts for people, gifts for yourself. We give gifts, we give clothes for Christmas presents, birthday presents, and these sort of thing. And clothes are also essential, like with the example of the wedding dress, the suit and tie. Clothes are really big parts of our life and different sort of rituals that we have as well. So similar to eating meat, even though we associate clothes with lots of positive things, the supply chain or the production line, the consequences, the environmental consequences of both eating meat and consuming clothes tend to be really, really bad. And again, I find this quite interesting because of that difference between how immediately positively reinforcing it is, but how distantly bad it is for the environment. Okay, so we're gonna have a small activity here. So I just want you to think for a minute. The clothes that you're wearing right now, and it could just be a top or it could be, what have you. But the clothes that you're wearing right now, and don't worry if you don't know, I'm just not trying to guilt you because I actually did this to myself this morning and I failed my own test. So don't worry if you don't know that answer. Do you know where the clothes that you're wearing are made from? Like, do you know what country your top is made in? And secondly, do you know what fabric the material is? Like, what's the composition of the fabric? So I just want you to take a moment and just reflect and think whether or not you know the answer to that. If you want, you're welcome to put your answer in the chat box. And just, so no to both, Alex. Okay, I mean, this is kind of bad because ideally I would know the answers to these questions that come up with the quiz, but I tried it on this top that I was wearing, and it was from Mauritius, so it's a small island of Madagascar, which I didn't know. And it's a woolen top, and I thought it was just wool, but it's actually 80% wool and 20% nylon. Okay, so it's quite difficult, even for myself, to know exactly where our products are from. But I think what this just illustrates is that disconnect, is that we just really don't know where a lot of the stuff comes from. And it's not just clothes, of course. It could be a whole variety of other things, technology, and this is just a range of other things where this thing occurs, where this psychological disassociation between product and production occurs. But I think this is just a useful illustration. Okay, so let me just touch on the environment. I'm just actually reading the chat box. Some people are saying secondhand clothes, that's cool. Wool, Portugal, and cotton, nice. So we've got like 3 people that have got like nice organic cotton from like Europe, but I think probably like the remaining like 50 odd people who are quite probably in the same boat as me, that we don't know where our stuff's from, we don't know what it smells. Okay, so let's get on to the consequences. So I'm not going to go too much in detail on this, but similar to eating meat, there are massive environmental consequences to clothing production. A big part of that is, of course, fast fashion, that we don't just buy clothes and wear them, for decades and then they sort of wear out. We tend to have a culture of consuming fast fashion, so consuming clothes just a few times, buying more clothes. This is partly because these clothes are cheap, but it's also partly because we don't value these sort of products and these sort of things. Okay, so similar to animal agriculture, producing clothes contributes to, water pollution, carbon emissions, chemical waste, a whole variety of things just in the production line. Not to mention the farming, if it's cotton, farming of the cotton, even these natural ingredients still involve a very resource intensive. But then the alternatives of, things like acrylic, nylon, and polyester, these are all oil derivatives, and of course have the carbon footprint associated with that. And then, of course, those oil derivative products break down less when we sort of try to recycle or throw them in the bin. The image at the bottom right, the rubbish truck, this is just to illustrate that most of our clothing ends up in the bin. Even if we recycle clothing to the charity stores, most clothing that goes to charity stores still ends up in the bin because they either can't sell the clothing or it's too difficult to wash, or there are problems with it. So just by and large, even clothing that goes to charity stores, most clothing just ends up in the bin. So there's just this massive problem with like the overconsumption of clothing. Again, this is similar to the meat consumption because we don't think about this stuff, and we sort of these things, these environmental consequences are out of sight and out of mind, and we tend not to think about them. Similar to if you think back to when I was talking about the psychology behind eating meat, there's both environmental consequences and there's also consequences for the beings, the animals who are harmed. Now, of course, with clothing production, there's a similar duality, that the consequences of the clothing supply chain are both environmental and also human. And so most of our clothing, all around the world, most clothing comes from Asia. And most of the people who work in these industries are women. And they tend to work in really horrible, atrocious conditions. And it's not just a few fringe shops that like buy from sweatshop clothing. This is like almost all clothes shops that you see on any major high street in the UK. This like bad working conditions, human exploitation, and environmental degradation are the rule for the fashion industry. It's not an exception. There's quite a lot of research on this. And if you're interested in looking into this, there's a lot of charities, a lot of research on this as well. So I encourage you to do that. Interestingly, more women tend to consume more clothes than men. So whereas men consume more meat, women consume more clothes. And so there's this interesting situation whereby it's women who are getting exploited from clothing production, but it's also women are more so likely to be purchasing those clothes. Okay, so So then, having said all this, why is it that we do this? What's sort of at the bottom of why we have this culture of consumption, where we tend not to think about these supply chains and production lines and the consequences of our actions? I think it's good to sort of point out that part of it is necessity. I don't think it's all bad. Some of it we can't necessarily avoid. Some of it's difficult. And, you know, clothes and food are pretty essential. So there's a baseline of sort of necessity. And I don't know where that baseline is. I'm not saying where that line is, but I think there's some sort of level of necessity here. Again, I'm not saying where it is, but at some level beyond necessity, there is this just massive culture, which I am involved in, you know, and I participate in as well. This is definitely, I want to sort of make it clear that I'm not sort of pointing the finger at other people. I'm just as much guilty of this as anyone else. We have this culture of just blind consumption, where we just buy stuff, whether it's clothes, whether it's you know, food, whether it's technology, you know, cell phones, computers. Again, I'm just as guilty of this as anyone, without thinking deeply or even reflecting on the supply chain and like what those behaviors have a knock-on effect on. This is an idea I got from Russell Brand, actually, and he talks a lot about how clothing and consumption of clothing, consumption of products in general, has become really ritualized. And so even our holiday seasons, you know, like the Christmas holiday season, is really now a shopping season. It's a consumption season. The same could be said for, you know, like Black Friday in America around holiday season, but then we also have this here. Even down to things like, you know, buying presents, birthday presents. A lot of our celebrations have been sort of co-opted by consumerism and by buying stuff for ourselves and other people. Okay, so thinking about this, what I would say is a problem or a concern, or at least a questionable concern, of this product production disconnect, and focusing on, so we focus a lot on direct harm in society, right? So most people tend to agree that, like, you know, harming someone, robbing someone, stealing something, assaulting someone is bad. Almost everyone agrees that's bad. But we don't think it's bad to like walk into a clothing store or online or what have you now, and buy clothing without thinking, well, what happened in the production of that piece of clothing? You know, what is the supply chain? And so we sort of have this idea it's fine to think, we just think morally, basically, about direct things, and we tend not to think morally about indirect things. Again, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing at the moment, because I think it makes historical sense, especially if we think about where psychology, and particularly social psychology, which is my sort of discipline, arose from, which was, you know, in Europe and America, off the back of the Second World War in last century. And so it makes a lot of sense that we're interested in and focused on direct harm, because last century it was very much in our faces. So again, I don't want to point the finger at anyone as to why we don't do this. I think it's understandable why, but I also think it could be useful to start to reflect and pay attention to indirect harm as well coming into this century. It's also worth noting, and this is like something I definitely find, is that, you know, being ethical, buying ethical is just so bloody time consuming. And, you know, some people, some environmentalists are not going to like me saying that, but that's my perspective. That's what I think it is. I've spent hours and hours and hours, you know, trying to find, you know, information about supply chains, and like, not just for the research, but also for my own personal consumption. And sometimes you just end up giving up because it's just so opaque. Like this, this connection between the product and the production is so strong, and the way these companies are built and orchestrated is such that it's difficult for consumers to find out what happens in the production of these products. We take the example of the image of the tag there of this piece of clothing made in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a big country. I mean, saying just made in Bangladesh doesn't really tell us much about that product and about the production line. And so we're really given such tiny pieces of information about the products we consume, which of course then begs the question, well, how much of this stuff is individual responsibility? Should we bear the responsibility of all this stuff on the shoulders as consumers? And I don't think we should. I think that we also need to consider, you know, government and corporate responsibility in this as well. And that's also something where I think it's good to have a diversity of ideas in this sort of conversation about these sorts of things, because, you know, me personally, and psychology, even as a discipline, can't answer all these questions about sustainability as well. Like, I think that psychology is well placed to provide some of the role, but there are also big questions about, you know, politics, about economics, about how, you know, society is run, and what we sort of value and prioritize as a culture, that is sort of beyond the scope of just psychology alone. So these are sort of some big questions, and I don't want to make them out to be too trivial, or like psychology alone will be able to answer these questions, because I think they're much bigger than that. So I'm just seeing in the comments that some people are giving some good examples of places where you can, I'm guessing, about like find out about different clothing brands and sustainability. So thank you very much. That stuff is really awesome. So definitely check that out if you can see that stuff. So thank you very much, everyone. Okay, so let's have a look. So if we compare this clothing tag made in Bangladesh on the bottom right of the screen, let's compare this to something where we might think resembles more of like corporate responsibility. So like, what does corporate responsibility actually look like in fashion? So I think this company doing is a good example. Of course, I'm sure you don't need to say, but I've got no affiliation with this company. But it just happens to have, from what I've seen, one of the most transparent information about its production line. Now, this company is not perfect. Some of the other materials, like their cotton, comes from India. But I think it's interesting, even just looking at this, like looking at the wording of this. So at Dilling, we care about the whole supply chain. I mean, so many big companies just can't say that because they just don't. So looking at the different images here, you know, you can see that they're talking about where the fabric comes from, where it's spun, where is it designed and constructed and put together to like make the pieces of fabric, and then where is that fabric cut, and then where is that fabric sewed together into products. Of course, this is not perfect. I'm not saying this is a perfect company or even anything like that. But I think just sort of thinking about how many different aspects in the supply chain and that this company is at least trying to be honest about that is really cool. You know, even better than that is to actually physically see, like, where are these clothes made, where are these products made. And again, this ties back in with the meat consumption, because of course, the meat industry doesn't want people to see the environmental or the animal consequences of producing meat, because they know it's going to put people off. And it's the same with the fashion industry. The fashion industry, and it's not just the fashion industry, other industries too, but just as an example, the fashion industry also doesn't want us to think about how the products are made or the supply chains, because doing so reveals how degrading it is for the environment and for people around the world. So if just, yeah, actually, no, that's okay. That's okay. All right, I'm just going to I'm coming to the end, so I'm mindful I want to give some time for questions. So thanks for your patience. Thanks, Alan. Okay, so just have a couple more slides. So what can we do about this stuff individually? Of course, there are the options of eating less meat, consuming less stuff, paying attention to supply chains, and also thinking about being mindful about company virtue signaling. So, some brands, they'll have, it's very in vogue to have an environmental statement, but most of them are absolute rubbish and meaningless in my opinion. It's just saying that to try and please and virtue signal to customers to sort of resolve us of guilt and resolve them of guilt, to make us feel better about buying stuff without them actually doing anything meaningful. So just be mindful of that is one thing I would say. Okay, but again, this problem is not just an individual problem. This is a sort of cultural, societal, even international problem. So what can we do about it together? Again, paying attention to supply chains is going to be important here. There are also bigger questions, which I don't have the answer to, but I think that are good to ask nonetheless. Questions, like whether our political and economic systems serve environmental interests and serve, the public's interest. Again, I'm not saying I have the answers to that, but I think these are the sort of questions that could be talked about. Again, I mentioned before that there are limits and bounds to what psychology can and cannot do in terms of this field. And I'm definitely open to alternative ideas from different disciplines and different people. And that's what I'd like to do now, to open the floor to the audience to see if you have any questions or any comments about the talk. I will just, before do that, just briefly have this final slide about looking to the future, which is, I guess, kind of just to sum this up, so in my sort of blurb of the talk, I was saying that culture is both a problem and a solution to this stuff. So I think I've demonstrated that the big part of our consumerist culture and consuming meat and clothing as examples are really problematic for the environment. But that's not just our consumer behavior that's a problem. There exists these powerful aspects of culture which also threaten the environment. And so that's what these sort of ideas and this sort of cultural shift is up against. But there is a cultural shift. Meat consumption is decreasing in the UK, but it's very slow. Environmental awareness is increasing, but again, it's slow. The internet, I think, speaks for itself and how brilliant it is and how we can have this conversation right now because of the internet. So I just want to give props to the internet. Again, like, there is this culture of paying attention to the supply chains. And like people have said, there are different ways that we can, there are different charities and organizations out there. If you just search for, whether it's about, animal agriculture or whether it's about fashion or other products as well, there are lots of people talking about this and writing about this stuff. So if you're interested in that stuff, if you're interested in any of these topics that I've been talking about here, I encourage you to look elsewhere and to read a bit more about it and find out a bit more about it. But yeah, I just want to leave it there, and thanks very much for your attention.